So, jetzt kann ich mich auch über das Mikrofon hören. Sehr schön.
Now I can hear myself by
Ein
the
herzliches
microphone. I would like to
Willkommen zum
welcome
heutigen
everyone
Auftakt der
to
Diskursreihe Schrecklich
tonight's
schön.
kickoff
Mein Name
of
ist Shana Bobinger und wir
Terrible
haben heute eine
Beauty,
hybride
this
Veranstaltung,
series of
wie wir sie
discourses. My
vielleicht
name
schon
is
seit
Shannon Bobinger and we have a
den
hybrid
neuen Formaten
event
von
today. You might be
aufgrund
familiar
von
with
Corona
this
kennen,
new
dass wir
format
einerseits
that we
Publikum online
launched
haben,
during the
das
COVID
unter
pandemic.
anderem auch in
We
Kenia
have
zugeschaltet
an
ist,
online
als auch
audience, some
Sie,
of
werte
whom
Gäste
are
und Gästinnen,
logged on from
über die ich
Kenya,
mich sehr freue, hier auch im
and
Raum
a
zu
few
haben,
guests
sodass wir die
here
Gelegenheit
in
haben,
this
später
hall, which I'm very happy
gemeinsam in den
about. So we
Austausch
will
zu kommen.
have the opportunity
Und
to
ich
engage
darf
in a
auf jeden
dialogue
Fall
later
zwei
on.
Gästinnen auch
I have the
vorstellen.
pleasure of
Eine
introducing
Person,
two
Frau
guests.
Herbinger sitzt mir ja
Ms. Herbinger
nebenan
is sitting
gegenüber
next to
und dann
me,
haben wir noch
and
Frau Kahumbu
Ms.
zugeschaltet,
Kahumbu
die, wie wir sie
is
hier auf
logged
dem
on,
Bildschirm auch sehen
and you
können.
can see her on
Und an der
screen.
Stelle finde ich es auch immer schön, auch wenn es digital stattfindet, einen
Even
kleinen
if this is
Begrüßungsapplaus.
the digital space, please have a round of applause for these two.
Ja, Frau Kahumbu hat
Ms.
eine
Kahumbu
Übersetzung zugeschaltet,
will
falls Sie sich
receive
wundern,
translation.
warum ich sozusagen auf Deutsch spreche,
So if
die
you
im Endeffekt
wonder
simultan,
why
während wir uns hier
I
unterhalten,
am
an
speaking in
Frau
German,
Kahumbu
Ms. Kahumbu is
übersetzt.
receiving
Genau. Und
simultaneous
umgekehrt
interpretation
natürlich
into
auch, wenn es
English,
Fragen auf Deutsch
and
gibt, werden die entsprechend dann auch auf
if there
Englisch
are
übersetzt.
questions from your
Schrecklich
side in
schön
German, they will be
heißt die
translated into
Ausstellung
English.
und
So
der
the
Auftakt des
exhibition's
heutigen
title
Gesprächs.
is
Wir wollen
Terrible
uns
Beauty,
darüber unterhalten,
and
austauschen
we
und
want to
von
talk
zwei
about
SpezialistInnen einfach erfahren, wie sieht der
and
Status
hear
quo
from
aus
our
in
two
puncto
experts what the
Tierschutz
status
und
quo is in
Wilderei
terms of
und welche Spannungsfelder
animal
gibt es
protection
und
and
inwieweit
poaching,
gibt es da vielleicht auch
what
aus einer,
realms of
jetzt mal,
action can be
kolonialen
identified,
Perspektive
also
Dinge
from a
aufzuarbeiten,
colonial and
neu zu
post-colonial
besprechen und zu
perspectives,
sehen, wie kann eine
what kind of
Zukunft
investigation
aussehen,
is
die
needed
trotz
and
eines
examination of the
problematischen
past.
Systems
What are the
trotzdem
prospects for the
proaktiv
future?
mitgestaltet werden
How
kann,
can we
hin
make a
zu
proactive
vielleicht einem
contribution
Status, wie sie da
towards
weiter, in dem einfach der Status quo
desirable
besser
status, which will
Sie sind
bring about a
herzlich
more desirable
eingeladen,
status quo? You are
mitzudiskutieren,
all
Fragen zu
welcome to
stellen.
engage in this
Wir wissen,
discussion.
dass
Please
der
ask
Raum,
questions
in
if you
dem wir
feel
uns
like
heute
it.
befinden, das Humboldt-Forum,
The
sehr
Humboldt
viel
Forum,
diskutiert wird.
where we are
Und auch
located
das soll
here,
eben ein Raum sein,
wants
in
to
dem
provide a
wir
lot
das
of
gemeinsam
space for
tun
discussion.
wollen und können.
This is what we
Falls
want to
kontroverse
do.
Fragen
We
sind,
want to
herzlich
take
willkommen.
controversial
Und ich
questions.
freue
They are
mich
very welcome,
erstmal,
and I'm
Frau
thrilled to be
Kahumbu
able to
vorzustellen. Ich werde
introduce
dazu
Ms.
ein paar,
Kahumbu first.
ja, ein paar Details
So,
von ihr teilen,
to
denn
that end, I
mir
want to
ist
share a
sehr,
few details
sehr,
about
sehr
her,
spannend.
because
Frau Kahumbu
her
ist
career is
Geschäftsführerin
very
der
interesting.
kenianischen
She's the
Naturschutz-NGO
managing director of the
Wildlife Direct,
Kenyan
leitet seit 2014 die
conservationist NGO
Kampagne
Wildlife
Hands Off
Direct,
Our
and
Elephants,
since
Hände weg von unseren
2014 she's
Elefanten.
been heading the
Eine
campaign
Kampagne zur
called Hands
Wiederherstellung
Off
der
Our
kenianischen
Elephants. It's a
Führungsrolle im
campaign for the
Elefantenschutz
reconstruction
durch
of the
Verhaltensänderungen
Kenyan
auf
leadership
allen Ebenen der
role
Gesellschaft,
in protecting
von ländlichen
elephants
Gemeinden
from
bis hin zu
behavioral
Wirtschaftsführern
changes
und
at all
politischen
walks of
Entscheidungsträgern.
society,
Die
from rural
preisgekrönte
areas
kenianische Naturschützerin
to
hält einen Doktortitel des
business leaders
Princeton
and political
University
decision
in
makers.
Ökologie und
Ms. Kahumbu
Evolutionsbiologie
holds
studierte,
a
bevor sie
PhD
ihre
from Princeton
Feldforschung in
University, where she
Elefanten in Kenia
studied
durchführte.
ecology and
Nochmal ein
evolutional
herzliches
biology
Willkommen und
before she
sehr, sehr
started
schön,
her
dass Sie
field
heute
research
online
on
dabei
elephants in
sein können.
Kenya. Welcome, Ms. Kahumbu.
Thank you.
Zu meiner Zu meiner Linken habe ich einmal
At my
Ilke
left,
Herbinger. Sie ist
I would like
Biologin und
to
seit
welcome
2011
Ilke
Programmleiterin
Herbinger. She's a
für Zentral-
biologist,
und
and since
Westafrika des
2011 she has been an
WWF Deutschland.
advisor and
Während
program
ihres 12-jährigen
director for
Aufenthalts
Central
in
and Western
Westafrika
Africa
und
of the
Leitung einer
WWF
internationalen
in
NGO
Germany.
zum Schutz von Tropenwäldern und
She
Schimpansen bietet sie
works.
umfangreiche und
She has been
direkte
working for an
Erfahrungen zum
international
Thema
NGO for the
Wilderei,
protection
Handel
of
von geschützten
tropical
Arten
forests
vor
and
Ort sammeln.
chimpanzees, and she
Ihre
has been
Projekt-
able
und
to gather quite a lot of experience
Programmmanagement-Expertise hat sie in den
on the
vergangenen
topic
10
of
Jahren auf
poaching
Zentralafrika
and
erweitert.
trading
Hier
in
beschäftigt sie sich
protected
besonders mit
protected
den
species.
teils
As a
grenzübergreifenden
project
Verwaltung
and
von
program
Schutzgebieten,
manager, she
inklusive
has
Law
been
Enforcement, der
focusing
Einrichtung eines
on
regionalen
her work on
Wildlife-Crime
Central
Hub und dem
Africa,
Aufbau von
and
Kapazitäten.
she
Herzlich willkommen,
has
schön, dass Sie da sind.
instigated a regional wildlife crime hub and
Ja,
is
bei
working
dem
on
Titel
capacity
Schrecklich
building.
schön.
Welcome, thank
Was
you.
waren da
When it
vielleicht
comes to the title, Terrible
ersten
Beauty,
Gedanken
what were your first
dazu?
thoughts?
Die Frage geht
This
an
is a
Sie
question
beide, einmal Frau
to both of
Kahumbu
you,
und auch,
Ms.
Frau
Kahumbu and
Herbinger,
Ms.
in dem
Herbinger.
Kontext von Wilderei
So
und
this is in the context
Tierschutz.
of poaching
Schrecklich schön.
and
Was waren
animal
die ersten
protection.
Gedanken?
So terrible beauty, what comes to mind first?
Well, if I go first, I would say I was a little bit surprised with the title because elephants are extraordinarily beautiful animals. To those of us who have the privilege of seeing them as tourists, of studying them, they are incredibly intelligent, friendly, playful, inventive, just amazing animals. And many of our communities in Africa have a very strong relationship with elephants, an ancient relationship. In Kenya, for example, some people believe that we came from elephants, that to be a good person is to be like an elephant. And but when you look at an elephant, it's a very big, strange animal. And for some people, especially nowadays, where you have a problem of human-elephant conflict, an elephant may seem like a very terrible animal. It's dangerous, it can harm you, it can destroy your property, it can injure you or kill people. And so for many people in Africa, the relationship with elephants is shifting from an ancient, very spiritual relationship to something which is very practical, day-to-day, a real conflict between humans and elephants. So this name is very fitting because it describes this contradiction. They are beautiful, but in some ways they can be very terrible.
Vielen Dank dafür.
Thank you very much. I think I will definitely take up one of these points later on. Ms. Herbinger, what was your first association with this title, Terrible Beauty? Well, I associated the beauty with the elephant and the terror with its history and with the history of poaching. So I would like to agree with Paula. The elephant is a very symbolic figure. It can only be found majestic and beautiful. Of course, there are regions in the rural spaces where elephants and people come together, where there's not enough space for both to coexist, and there are a lot of conflicts, especially in Africa. But the terror is not something I associate with the animal, but rather with the colonial past. The forest elephant was classified as threatened by extinction, which shows that the history of the elephant or around the elephant is also a bit terrible. Maybe we can also take a look around here in the room and ask ourselves what the status quo for elephants in terms of animal protection is like here on the continent.
Are you asking me? Sorry.
To Ms. Kahumbu?
Yes, thank you. The situation for elephants is every few years it changes. In the 1980s, elephants' populations were really declining very rapidly, almost to extinction. And then the ban on ivory trade took place. People around the world understood that ivory trade was destroying populations of elephants across the continent. By now, elephant numbers had reduced from millions to just a few 100,000, and they were in pockets, just isolated pockets around the continent. And in some places, just blinking out, populations gone completely. But the ban on ivory trade allowed many populations to recover, and a lot of effort, a lot of conservation initiatives, a lot of community participation until 2008, 2009, more ivory trade took place. Elephant populations came under very heavy pressure. Illegal trade exploded. There was catastrophic decline of elephants in places like Tanzania, nearly 80% of the elephants killed in just 5 years. So the situation of elephants is, again, we are on a path of recovery because now I think it's recognized globally. The ivory trade is so destructive, but you have populations which have reached a very tenuous level. And when elephant populations decline and become smaller and smaller areas, humans come in and occupy that space. So now as the population starts to grow again, there isn't enough space for elephants. And we are seeing a lot of places where there's a lot of challenges for elephant populations because they cannot move, they cannot expand, they cannot meet each other anymore. So you can't have exchanges. Every year we have some 5 elephants walk to Nairobi city from Masai Mara. This is like they are trying to return to a path which they have known for hundreds, maybe thousands of years, but they can't anymore. There are farms, there are people, there are fences, there are bridges, roads, and railways. So it's very, very difficult for elephant populations to recover to the population size they used to be. But all over Africa, we're seeing a different challenges. In some countries, elephant numbers are increasing. Southern Africa, for example, Botswana, Zimbabwe, South Africa, elephant numbers are increasing. In many parts of Africa, the populations continue to decline, and overall, the populations are still declining, especially in the rainforests, where elephants continue to be killed because the black market for ivory trade continues to thrive in the world.
Okay. Wie sieht das aus Ihrer Perspektive aus?
Okay, what's your point of view? What's your point of view from the WWF, where you are working? Well, you know, there are two kinds and species of elephants. The elephant used to be the elephant. Now we have the African savanna and the African forest elephant. Both populations are in a different state, in a different situation. There are some rather stable and recovered populations, especially in the south, but also in the east of Africa, there's a major decline in elephant populations. In the Congo basin in Central Africa, where I'm active, forest elephants are generally not so well off. We only have 100 to 150,000 elephants of 470,000, roughly 470,000 elephants altogether. And in the Congo basin, the green heart of Africa, out of 10 elephants, 7 elephants die of a non-natural cause, so they are being poached, which is untenable, because more elephants are dying than are even being born. If we don't do anything to remedy this, you know, elephants have been able to recover, but if we don't do enough to remedy this situation, they will die out. So, and this is especially true for the forest elephant, and the forest elephant doesn't have such a high growth rate. It's much lower than that of the savanna elephant. It's much more susceptible for poaching, and it can't really recover as well from poaching. So that said, we need to do everything to protect both forest elephant and savanna elephants. It's about time we developed effective protective mechanisms, and I think Paula will agree, and she can say a lot more about this. We are living in a fragmented world. People need to live and coexist with animals in many areas, and we need to find mechanisms to make this successful. Yes, I want to talk about this and about maybe existing concepts, and I would also like to know, Ms. Kahumbu, could you describe what your work is about? What is your role in this complex intersection of man, human beings, elephant system, the system of increasing demand or still high demand of ivory? What's your role in this whole complex?
Well, I am an expert on elephants, so I studied elephants. My original role was to support the Kenya government with policy decisions to stop the killing of elephants for their ivory. Their ivory is just their teeth. They're 2 incisors. The whole animal is killed only for that, in order to serve European, Asian, American markets. That work has been very successful, and elephant ivory trade has declined significantly over the years. In Kenya and across Africa, the problem is that there is still a black market. Ivory poaching continues, and so we work to strengthen the laws, to ensure that there is compliance, to support enforcement, especially in the courtroom, to make sure that the judges take it very seriously, because for many people, killing an elephant or a lion or any other species is a petty offense, a very minor problem. It's not like killing a human being. And so in the past, the penalties have been very low, and many people have been released from being sentenced because of perhaps sympathy. Maybe it's considered they are very poor, maybe they don't have any other alternative. So we've been looking at, so how do we make sure that the law works well to deter those criminals? That's one really important area. But over the years, I've realized that actually we need much more than that. As you know, the conservation of elephants and all wildlife in Africa, this whole conservation movement actually began with colonial days. The national parks were created, many of them during the colonial times. And African people have never been seen as at the heart of conservation. Yes, we are employed as rangers, as wardens, as office bearers, but it has never been part of our culture and made part of our pride to protect and conserve these animals. In fact, across the whole continent, wildlife is seen as an asset, money, walking on four legs with tusks, because maybe tourists will come and see them, not part of our heritage, not part of our pride, our history, our culture. And so I've started making wildlife documentaries to revive and remind our people of these great animals that have amazing stories in our past, told to us by our grandparents. We want our children to grow up loving these animals and wanting to be scientists, conservationists, storytellers, teachers, you name it. And so this work has taken me back to basics. Films for general television, because most of the documentaries about our wildlife have never been seen in Africa by Africans. They've never been translated into languages that Africans can understand. And most of them have never involved Africans in the making of those films. You will hardly find a crew with an African person holding a camera or speaking to the camera. So my organization is trying to transform this space, make our wildlife storytelling part of ourselves, engage our own people, tell our own stories in a way which is very authentic. And I believe this will create a new relationship with nature, a new consciousness, and a citizenry that is environmentally very literate. This will influence our leaders who make the decisions. As we go to elections, we can start to demand that our governments have green manifestos and policies and laws that protect the environment. Even if we can save elephants from poaching, we have so many other threats to these majestic animals: climate change, land use change, roads and railways which interfere with their movements, and then, of course, as I mentioned, human-wildlife conflict. So I'm looking at it from a much bigger level. I want Africans and African experts to be the world's experts, to be the world's voice for these amazing animals, so that we save them for ourselves and for the whole world.
I have found and seen that you have created a format, Ms. Kahumbu, which I think you call Wildlife Warriors. And what is special there is that these are formats made for the continent, for an African audience, made by African producers, so as to get this connection, the relationship. Could you tell us something about the Wildlife Warriors?
Yes, thank you. Wildlife Warriors is a television series that shines a light on African conservationists at the front line. The rescuers, the scientists, the rangers, even the business people who are saving wildlife. They are people that our local communities can relate to. They tell us their personal story, where they were born, what their parents told them. For many Kenyans, including myself, my parents were like, you can't do conservation as a career. That's not a career. You should be doing something like architecture or dentistry. That's how you can make money. But many, many people fall in love with nature when they have watched amazing documentaries, or they have a chance to go into the national parks and see these incredible animals. So Wildlife Warriors is designed to tell those stories, but also to be told by a crew that is fully African. So my crew are local cameramen. Kenya and Africa has a very vibrant film industry, but none of those crews have ever filmed wildlife and nature. It's kind of a specialized field. So I take my crew into the wild. They have to learn how to be with animals, how to get close to animals, how to predict what are the animals going to do and tell those stories. And now my crew is fanatical conservationists. And this is what I think needs to happen. A new, I would say, a critical mass of wildlife filmmakers and storytellers who are fully Africans. This will, I think, completely change our understanding, our belief system, and the conservation of Africa's nature. It's not just elephants. Elephants happen to be a very good species for us as a hook, because you only have to listen to an elephant or see a baby elephant playing or see a mother elephant taking care of her calf, protecting it from the sun or shading it from the sun, protecting it from a lion, and you fall in love with these animals. But we want people to fall in love with all of our animals and to understand we have whales, we have dolphins, we have lions and hyenas and many other species that our people have forgotten about and maybe don't understand. Snakes, for example, they often get killed out of ignorance, complete ignorance, because people believe that they are going to harm them. But if we can educate people and teach them about the beauty of reptiles, the important role they play in the ecosystems, and the benefits that they bring to us, then I think we'll have more tolerance and more compassion and just generally more love for nature.
I've certainly developed an even greater curiosity to see wildlife warriors. Thank you for this very much. Now, Ms. Habinger, I would like to know, what is your role at the WWF? What's your work like? How can we imagine what you do? I'm a program director at WWF Germany. And the World Wildlife Fund is a worldwide network. We have WWF offices working in the global north, and we then support program offices that are on site in, say, Africa. And the real work is done on the spot. And 90% of the people are local. More than 95+% are local people coming from the country who are conservationists from the region where our office is. But they're then supported by things like our office, because here in Germany we simply have more capacity to raise funds, to engage in communication. And all that Paula has described is very important to also teach the people here, because ultimately somebody who is in Europe or in the global north will find it even more difficult to relate. I mean, for people like us, it's much more difficult to understand, why should I protect the elephant that lives somewhere in Africa? Nothing to do with me. And I think the role we have is to say it concerns us all. The elephant is like a forest gardener, making sure the forests get rejuvenated, can absorb carbon dioxide. Where there are elephants, many studies tell us the forest is sort of purified. Smaller trees are removed, larger trees can grow better. As a result, more CO2 is stored, and that in turn helps the global climate. So it helps all of us. So elephants are forest gardeners. They have a strong cultural importance on the spot, and that is very difficult sometimes to relate to. But after all, there are so many tourists traveling to Africa just to see these big game animals. So there is at least what I would call a sort of recreational character that people value. But there is more. There is an economic value, because every elephant is a carbon storage enhancer, if you like, and that gives it a service value for the ecosystem. And I think it's one of our problems these days that we always relate things to value. Real estate is value, but nature is not something which we assign value to. We don't value nature enough. And here the global north and the global south can cooperate. I think we need to derive concepts where existing forests and living animals are simply considered to be worth more alive than when they're dead. Yes, you can make money from ivory, but if you have a living elephant, you can make more of it because you serve the whole system. You serve all of us, humankind, much better than killing an elephant and selling ivory for $40,000. And with this concept, we can work with each other, both continents, and something like the wildlife warriors or other people who do filming on the spot, who actually tell us what these animals are, what they do. That can help so people here in the north understand how important, how majestic these animals are, and also how important they are for preserving the very nature we all need to live in. Ultimately, you've taken the wind out of my sails. And, well, my question now would have been, why should we in the global north be concerned with animal conservation on the African continent? What's the gain in it? What's the benefit for us? Here in Berlin, what does it benefit us? Or, I mean, the WWF is a European structure primarily, so the question is, what are the interests here? What use has it? I think a lot has changed over time. Also, conservation has changed. We moved away from this idea that the West wants to protect the South and the West knows better how things are done. No, we have to do conservation the way it is wanted, desired, and also feasible on the ground. And it's sometimes a cumbersome way of getting there. But I think increasingly we see that conservationism is driven by the people on the spot because locals know best how to protect their nature in such a way they can cope and live with it. Because ultimately, if I work at the WWF, I'm not the one protecting nature. That's the people who live with elephants, who let elephants live. These are the true guardians of nature. But I can help them. In my function at WWF Germany, I try to help the communication so that the subject is known better here, that I move people to commit. I mean, climate change is now a word that everybody knows, but biodiversity and the crisis that we have with so many species being lost, that's not something which is as high in the agenda everywhere as climate change is. And my job, if you like, for the years that I've got left, is to contribute to people seeing and realizing the seriousness of the loss of biodiversity and that it matters as much as climate change. We all need an intact, a healthy environment. We've seen that with a view to COVID. You can't say just because there is a virus which is developed from this interplay man and animal. I mean, it's just there are so many more interactions. And yes, a disease can also develop. And that only happens when the environment is no longer as it should be, when man and animal come into ever closer contact and conflict. If we can help preserve nature in a way that is healthy, we help all of us. I would like to also involve the elephants in the room, as it were. And I've been struck by the fact that none of the elephants we have around here has any visible tusks. Not at least as far as I can see. I mean, you've just looked at this sort of pile in the center, because in the center of this room, I must perhaps explain this, we've got a whole pile of what are supposed to be, they are burned tusks. I don't know whether the camera can show it so that Paula Kahumbu can see it too. So my question to you, Ms. Kahumbu, is, when did you recognize this change away from a sort of mindset where now we see that on the African continent people are recognizing, yes, we wish to and we have to take animal conservation, nature conservation into our own hands, in our own way, so that whatever is left of diversity can be protected, so that consumption and material interests from the global north will not make these things die. Was there a particular time where you thought this is when this change happened?
I think it's happening in different ways in different parts of the continent. I was very lucky. I grew up in Nairobi. I went into the wild as a young girl. I had a lot of amazing people around me, Richard Leakey, Ian Douglas Hamilton, Cynthia Moss, and others. And all of those people are white people. In fact, when I was a child, the only names in conservation were white people. And till today, it's still very similar, not only in Kenya, across the entire continent. So there has been a very slow shift. Increasingly now, Africans are looking to becoming scientists and becoming experts in conservation. And in Kenya, for example, now, the Wildlife Authority is fully Kenyan. But it's still a real challenge. As you heard, for us to get the funding to train somebody to the level that I'm trained, a PhD from Princeton, it's just happening too slowly. There are very few organizations will support African students to go to international universities and get the caliber of education that we need to be able to stand on an international platform and speak for these animals and these wild places. But there is a shift happening, and governments increasingly are adopting the provisions of many of the international conventions, whether it's the Climate Change Convention, the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the IUCN meeting, which just took place in Marseille, the PARCS congresses, which are taking place. We are seeing governments adopting agreements, but adopting an agreement is simply a political agreement. I often go to these meetings and I get very disappointed that these African countries were not bringing their own agenda. They were just responding to somebody else's agenda and saying, okay, we agree with it or we don't agree with it. But now we are seeing African countries are stepping up and saying, this is our agenda. We want to have elephants in the wild and we are going to reject ivory trade. So this has been the number one issue, actually, in many of the conventions, has been the ivory trade, whether it should be allowed or not, because some people, especially outside of Africa, think that it's a really good idea to sell ivory because it's going to bring money. And these countries are complaining we don't have money for conservation. And you have countries like Kenya and many other African countries saying no, because it only makes the problem much worse. Elephant ivory, rhino horn trade in animals like lions, and many other species. It's really still a big challenge. And I would say we haven't gotten to the level that we need to be at, but we do see a very large number of young people who are standing up, who are speaking out, who are participating in international events, who are demanding more from their governments. But it's not easy. It's not easy. We lose people. People are being murdered for fighting for nature, fighting for wild places. They are losing their lives for their belief, for their faith in nature. So it's something which is every time I feel like we have made some progress, I feel there is more pressure against us. I work with school children, and sometimes I find it very difficult to encourage them to be courageous, to go out there and support the defense of forests in their neighborhood, the rivers, the oceans, the coral reef, when they have very powerful African people who want to do business, who want to be rich like people they've seen elsewhere. We have government that wants Kenya to look like China or Dubai or America or Germany, right? It's very hard to challenge them. And so we have a point in time now where we are at a crossroads. We have to choose. Do we as Africans want to be modern industrial nations with all the same problems as everyone else, pollution, destroyed environment, loss of species? Do we want that? Or do we want to have this incredible natural gift that we inherited, Africa is really the least developed continent, but it also has the most natural environment of all the continents in the world. And all of this is changing rapidly because we are grappling with this problem. And my president, for example, President Uhuru Kenyatta, has spoken very positively about sustainable development. He argues that we cannot do development at the cost of nature. That is not sustainable. But yet we still see development happening at the cost of nature across the nation. And we see it across the continent. Demand for oil, demand for minerals, demand for timber, fisheries. These things are destroying our natural environment and our wilderness every day. And until we have really good policies and procedures which can be enforced, especially around land use, where our national parks are sacred. Like today, we have many national parks are under threat because they have discovered oil, they've discovered gold, they've discovered other minerals or valuable timbers. It's going to take a lot more effort, a lot more work, and it cannot be done by Africans alone. It cannot be done locally alone. It really does require a global collaboration to support those courageous people on the ground who are fighting to save this incredible assets. We know some things, for example, we just heard that elephants play this incredible role in the forest. Elephants are one of the most well-studied species in the world. And yet, anybody who's studying elephants will tell you we are only scratching the surface. These animals are amazing. We don't really know that much about them, despite decades of research. So imagine everything else that we are losing, and we don't even understand. We have no way of comprehending how much damage we are causing. We are losing things before we know them. So I think that we need to really build a global alliance that is strong and unshakable, because saving the African rainforest is not just for elephants. It will be a part of the solution for global climate change. If we don't collaborate globally, and climate change continues to affect every continent, and here in Africa, we see it very severely. Northern Kenya is almost a desert now. I've been seeing videos in the last 24 hours of animals collapsed, no food, no water. They are not only domestic animals, but many wild animals. They're just dying in the thousands. It's heartbreaking. It's really heartbreaking, especially because these problems are not local. We can see the local impact, but these are global problems. And until we really acknowledge and address these problems as global problems, we will be unable to stop the extinctions of very many species, including our beloved elephants.
I would love to follow up about something you said. You are talking about the status quo and the problems that are visible worldwide, that uncover global interconnectivities. And now it's becoming even more clear what that means. And to be fair, it also uncovers the effect of cause and effect. So what, in your opinion, is the role of colonial continuities, for example?
That's a very wonderful question. I have a colleague, his name is Joseph Ogutu. He's actually studying in a Dutch university, or he teaches in a Dutch university. He's been studying exactly what you just asked me. What is the long-term effect of colonial decision-making? He went back to 1902 when some very important decisions were made in Kenya. Kenya got independence in 1963. And everybody is concerned about what we're seeing today, and he's reminding us this came from hundreds of years ago. Decisions were made. Certain actions and decisions were put into motion, and they continue to have an effect today. For example, if you go to Masai Mara, Everybody believes that the wildebeest migration is just like a clock. Every year, these wildebeest are moving and how wonderful, everything looks great, but it's not. The wildebeest migration is shrinking. It's shrinking very significantly. And this year, very few wildebeest came into the Kenyan side, which was really shocking. In fact, it's so shocking, it's been kept out of the media. Why is this happening? It's because of land use change in all of the surrounding area. Just 20, 30 years ago, the wildebeest used to move 200 kilometers further north into Kenya. Now they are just coming just a small distance into the country. These are the visible things we can see in our lifetime. But most people think that this is the time period over which the change has happened, but it's not. When we look at the historical records, under the British, the wildebeest were going much further. But under the British, they also started a campaign of slaughtering animals in huge numbers because they wanted to do farming and they believed these animals were competing with livestock. So they would kill sometimes tens of thousands of animals in a very small area. And they also declared that the only people who can have a gun are white people. And all Africans were not allowed to have a gun and they were not allowed to kill animals, which translated into Africans are poachers, white people are hunters. And this is a legacy which continues until today. Often African people are considered the poachers, and the people, the colonials and ex-colonials are considered the saviors of wildlife because the hunters became the first conservationists. They are the ones who started the first national park. In fact, Roosevelt started one of the first parks in Tsavo in Kenya. So this legacy continues to impact on the psyche of African people. And as a result, there's a lot of conflict. A lot of records are now being uncovered which explain what was happening. And the problem is, the solution is you cannot go back to the past. You cannot just take the old way of doing things and bring it, because everything has changed. The land has changed, the climate has changed. The number of people in our countries has exploded. There's so many more people. And we need a new conversation. We need a new engagement and some transformation in our conservation methodologies. I don't believe we can succeed by continuing the way we've been going. We need to really acknowledge what has happened. We need to predict what will happen if it keeps going the way it's going. And we need new decision-making, which is a consensus by bringing in the voices of the people who are on the ground. If you look at all of the national parks in Africa, they are just a piece of boundary, like a small postage stamp separated from each other. When our wildlife is migratory, it cannot thrive when it's just contained within a small area like a zoo. It cannot thrive. We need to find a way of securing wildlife with this larger landscape because of the benefits that they bring to people. But the people who live there must benefit from that wildlife. As of today, there are very few examples in Africa where the local people benefit from the revenue that is generated, whether it's biodiversity credits, carbon credits, or water credits, whether it's tourism value or hunting, all of these things. We've not seen African people livelihoods improve significantly because of all of these efforts. And I think it's reaching a breaking point. It's really getting to a point where some very disastrous decisions are being made, which are only aggravating the problem. In some places, we are seeing a lot of people coming in and buying land and putting a massive fence and bringing in artillery, guns, helicopters, and making it very militant and a military approach. Maybe it will work in the short term, but in the long term, it's creating barriers, psychological barriers, physical barriers, and it is causing more anger and misunderstanding. This isn't good for conservation. That's why I think I don't have a solution, but I think that we do need more conversations. We need to return, understand what's happened, take responsibility for the things that have been done and the things which have worked and not worked, and find a new path which can secure, most of our animals and our wild places, our habitats, because it's too hard to imagine that we could lose these species. And yet, if you come to Kenya, come to a protected area called Olpejeta, there are only 2 remaining northern white rhino. Both of them are females. I filmed them this year, and it's really difficult not to want to cry when you see these 2 animals. They look like cows, but they're huge, they're beautiful, they look sad. They look like they know that this is the end of the line for this species. They have only each other. There's no other northern white rhinos in the world. It's really terrible. And I think it's going to shock many people in Africa when they see this, that this is what has happened because we were negligent, we were ignorant, and we didn't take enough actions to save them.
I would also like to know, from the point of view of an organization like yours, the WWF, how does such an organization deal with this imbalance that was established by colonial continuities? How does an institution like yours deal with this in the now? Well, nature conservation where did this change exist, or when did it start? Well, I think the contribution and the imbalance of power is a legacy from colonial times. It was already mentioned by Paula that just the way the boundaries were established, the boundaries between national parks in the south and eastern parts of Africa, this was a great problem then in the Congo Basin. But there are also rather ancient parks there. So you can see that cross-border protective areas encompassing different countries cannot be taken together for animals, but not for people either. There are national parks encompassing several countries, which is a continuum in terms of nature, and also the people who live there have the same traditions. So breaking down national parks or protective areas to national borders would break down the cooperation between these people, and also to the end of protecting animals. The way this administrative approach was based on a French colonial approach and hierarchy. The local population didn't have a lot of say in how this park was being administered, what the priorities are. I think there's a shift in this. And is this the current responsibilities? Yes, it is also the responsibility of international nature conservation organizations. We need to give people on the ground a say in how these areas are being administered, what's about access to resources, how can there be a contribution to decision making. So we don't only want them to be beneficiaries, we also want them to make a decision about how this land is administered and how these protective areas are administered. So who do we want to provide protection for? Do we want to protect them for the government, for the global north, for the tourists, or for those people relying on those local resources? I think these are very important questions that need to be addressed. Also, if we go down this road, we won't have the problem that protective areas provide protection against someone on the ground, but rather that those who administer these protective areas will also benefit. And if we accomplish that protective areas don't need to receive government protection, but that this protective task is mandated to the local population, we will have made some progress. But this also dates back to colonial decisions that this responsibility lies with the government. So laws need to be amended, and the local municipalities need to be acknowledged as holders of rights. So I think the monopoly often lies with the state and with the central government. So the municipalities who are actually concerned with animals destroying their agricultural land are not really a part of the decision. So, what is the situation? Who asked, who demanded for being able to reclaim responsibility? I can't really imagine what the situation is. Who voiced those demands? Well, I think stakeholders everywhere are increasingly speaking up. They are aware that human rights are to be awarded to people on the ground. And if they see that they have rights, they also speak up about their rights, about wanting to take advantage of those rights. In Africa, there's the Nobeki National Park in Cameroon, which is usually a strictly protected national park, and according to legislation or to case law, you are not allowed to enter the national park if you're not a tourist. Now the law has been amended to include local people to enter and gather mangoes, for example, and involve the bush elephant in traditional rites, spiritual rites, for example. So there's a process of adapting the rules to tradition. I think it's important that this is happening, but also the legal framework needs to be established, and the WWF can make a contribution in encouraging governments to go down this road. It's a difficult thing, because once you have power, you don't want to let it go. This holds true for many of these governments. Many of these governments also don't have enough money, so this is also something where we can make a contribution. And can you give examples of how the WWF can live up to its responsibility? Well, it can live up to its responsibility by upholding standards of nature protection and compatibility. And there's a principle such as free, prior, and informed consent. So if you provide information and get the consent of the local population, you have a lot better prospect of a successful project. So I don't impose my project on the local population, but rather I ask the people on the ground what they are concerned about, what they want, what their demands are. Then there's a decision on the ground. And only if they have been informed, if they give their consent, we ask our donors, our investors, whether it can be funded and whether the project can be initiated. It's always important to have this as a first step, to provide this information, getting consent, and then getting the funding. My next question would be, what's the situation if the local population say no, because there's an imbalance. There are power structures, there are questions of access. So what's the realistic picture? And a follow-up question, how diverse are the questions here for creating concepts which would make sense on the ground? So who's involved in drawing up concepts? Well, if you're serious about it, of course, you could come up with a funding opportunity and present this idea and ask them if they like it, and if they say no, of course we need to accept this. And is this the situation in reality? Yes, often it is, but this is our principle at the WWF, that we respect this structure, but the donor structures are not always that easy. If you want to develop a project, you sometimes only have 6 weeks' time. If you take this process seriously, maybe it doesn't take only 2 weeks for such a project to be drawn up, but rather 3 months. Many of the processes are not such that they allow for people on the ground to do everything in their own speed and involve their own mechanisms, which will then be accepted by donors in the Northern Hemisphere or in the Western world. So some processes don't really allow for that yet. It's a challenging situation, let's put it like this, but well, there are barriers and there are processes which need to be observed. So we all need to make a contribution in coming closer together. It is an ongoing process and it is a bit rocky. I would love to take a look around whether there are any questions in the audience here on site. If this is the case, I know that there is a microphone. Maybe we can ask Ms. Kahumbu or Ms. Herbinger, or maybe we can engage in a discussion. This is your moment to make a comment or ask a question. Please. Thank you. My name is Uta Combria. I'm with the Humboldt Forum Foundation. I would like to know from you at the WWF, what's your procedure? Many of the rationale of why elephants are supposed to be protected seem to be of economic nature. So there are nature services that is rendered by elephants. This is a strange, or seems to me to be a strange rationale, which seems obvious to us in the West, of course. But I'm wondering, is there some kind of philosophical, ethical rationale? Because these are arguments that have another relevance, another level of relevance, because being allowed to kill elephants or well, not being able to kill elephants or no longer being able to profit off these elephants, maybe this would be comparable to no longer allowing to sell Christmas trees in Germany or whatever.
Thank you. The question is to Ms. Herbinger. Oh, or to both, whoever would like. Well, thank you for this question. Speaking for the WWF and as a conservation organization and a conservationist myself, there is a huge intrinsic motivation for what we're doing. We call on protecting animal species because they're worth preserving, because they're rare, or because they show unique behaviors. I'm also somebody who studied, gorillas and related types of apes. So, we are in our organizations, we talk about images, metaphors, storytelling. All of that is very important. But to convince decision makers with storytellers to cough up investments of a scale that they actually have an impact, that is something where we reach our limits. And that's why it's very important to think of all three things together. One, is it culturally valuable what we're doing? In the Congo Basin, for example, for many, many years there was this right where they said the forest elephant had to be killed for a male initiation rite. That was banned for years. It's no longer banned. They are allowed to do it. But the state, the government, not we, but the state, we facilitated dialogue, but they came to an agreement that one elephant can be killed for several communities. So not all of them can kill their own elephant, because even they know themselves that elephants are threatened by extinction. So there is a way of approaching each other. But it's important that traditional rights and customs are taken seriously and that their importance is recognized. But equally, it's important to put forward the economic argument. Nature has value, and living nature is worth much, much more than once nature is dead or dying, has been destroyed. And I think you have to play all these arguments and decide where it makes more sense, use this one rather than this in a strategic sense. And with many governments or donors, sadly, the economic argument seems to be much more clear and understandable. But we want the private sector, investors from the private sector to get on board, because we can't just expect governments and individuals to effect change. As Paula said, the private sector has had a lot of negative impact and has still, because of the huge infrastructure projects that are happening. And this private sector needs to be convinced to work with and for nature conservation. And often the economic argument is the clincher that can convince investors. What other questions have you in the audience come up with, maybe?
Hello, guten Tag, vielen Dank.
Thank you.
I
think that all you're saying sounds so reasonable, and we're all sitting here and probably thinking, yes, that's a good way of doing it. But there is massive resistance, and it's not happening this way. Where is that resistance coming from, and how can you reach out to these people? In other words, there is an obstacle. How can we get across it? Is that a question to anybody specifically or just generally? So the question, how we get across this obstacle, because all we hear sounds terribly reasonable, but how can we reach the people or arrive at structures that can really push that change?
Well, if I go first, I would say that the resistance is usually driven by the decision makers, the people who hold power. On the ground, the resistance perhaps is a matter of better engagements, discussions, and coming to consensus. But even on the ground, when you have agreements, I mean, I've seen it in my country, I've seen it in many other countries. Those agreements they don't live on their own. They are bound by much bigger government policies and visions. And I think that we need to reach both the people at the grassroots and we need to reach the people in the leadership. I'll give you an example in South Africa. Kruger National Park, when it was created and expanded during apartheid times, many Africans were thrown out of the park in order to create an even bigger park and have it as a cross-border protected area. And those communities went to court after apartheid was lifted, and they demanded to have their land back. And they proved that they came from in the middle of Kruger National Park. And it's not rocket science what they did. They had a conversation. Those particular communities, they engaged with the government, they negotiated, and they came to an agreement about who each would give something. The land belongs to those people. The court had made a decision. So they have the title deed for that land, but that land is inside of a protected area. And so they were told, these are the ways we can work together. And the community was given land outside. They were given some tourism opportunities. They were allowed to earn every dollar from that piece of land inside the park. And till today, it's a very successful model. And I think that such models can be replicated, but it does require a kind of engagement and negotiation where people listen. I am very surprised at how much compassion people have, how much tolerance people have in Africa for living with animals. So it's always been amazing to me. People lose their livestock to lions, or they lose their crops to elephants, but they are very tolerant. But it reaches a certain point where they are no longer tolerant. And sometimes the only thing they want is that somebody from high up in government acknowledges that this is a problem. They're not asking for, sometimes they're not asking for money, they're not asking for replacement, they're just saying, I want you to feel my pain. I want you to understand what I'm experiencing. And they want to be involved in the decision-making. Many of the new conservation areas in Kenya have been forged through these negotiated agreements. We now have 160 new conservation areas in Kenya. They occupy more land than all of the national parks and reserves that were set up by the colonial government. These were set up voluntarily by communities, by private landowners, because they believe in nature. They want to live a traditional life, and a traditional life involves wildlife living with them. And they're not making money. They're not millionaires. They are still suffering from many of the problems of human-wildlife conflict, but they have a certain pride in having made a decision themselves. And this has attracted a lot of international attention, this model of the communities voluntarily setting land aside. Sometimes they will say, we will move our village. I've been to one place. They moved the whole village outside of a certain area of land so that the lions could return, because the lions and the cattle, it was too much of a conflict. So the people moved, the area was kept aside. And today, when you go to this place, it's near Masai Mara, they have more lions than in the Masai Mara itself. It's phenomenal. And so they have tourism. And when I went there to see them, I found a whole family of local people, Maasai people, driving around in one of these 5-star tour vans, visiting their own protected area, going to see the hotel which they own as a community, sitting down to have lunch. I don't think they like eating American food or European food, but they wanted to experience being tourists in their own conservation area. And this was a negotiated agreement together with a private company and the community themselves. Didn't require government or anything. And I think that is the future. I think that we will not save everything, but we do have a window of time to negotiate agreements with communities and landowners and secure large parts of the continent and the wild species in a win-win scenario. And over time, these areas can become connected. They can restore the migration corridors for wildlife, whether it's butterflies, birds, wildebeest, lions, and many other species. I do think that there is a window of time. It will cost money. Doesn't happen for free. And that is where the international cooperation and collaboration can come to bear. The young children from those communities, what jobs do they want? They want to be tour drivers. They want to be hotel owners. They want to be working in the tourism industry or education, filmmaking, all these industries that require healthy wild spaces. So I find that very exciting and very positive. That's something that I would love to support.
Thank you very much for this insight. How do you see this, Ms. Herbinger? Where do we need to push and how in order to achieve a change at the structural level, driven maybe from within your structures? Well, I think so far we have failed miserably when it comes to maintaining our biodiversity. When we're looking at the goals we set in the last decades, virtually none of these have been achieved. So I think we do need to work in a transformative, a novel way. We need to be ready for change, be ready to think differently. It's the only way it can work. Unlike, if we don't do this, we'll have little isolated islands which we can keep alive for the next 50 years, and that will be all for all of us. When we're looking at the Amazon, it's the largest forested area in the world, but already there's more CO2 than they can store. The Congo Basin is the one huge forest area which is a carbon sink, in other words, absorbing more than it releases. And we need to understand that nature has value. It can be created locally through tourism, but we've seen through COVID, tourism can be iffy as well. In the whole of Central and Southern Africa, tourism utterly collapsed, thereby destroying the basis of life for many, many people. So tourism can't be it. We mustn't just put everything in all our eggs in one basket. So it's not just tourism. And there are many countries or areas where tourism is impossible anyway. So just one concept isn't enough to keep these forests alive. Other ways and means will have to be found. What I think we need is an interplay between different things. I also think the Global North needs to pay for the fact that other people live under much, much more difficult living conditions, but preserve nature. And North will have to appreciate this and pay for it too. There are concepts where we're now paying for rebuilding all this save this, save that process, where we are paying for reconstruction. Well, why don't we pay for what's still there, so that the people living somewhere are sacrificing a lot for maintaining the environment? And I think we need to pay for that. And the private sector should be willing to not destroy these last remaining areas and extract resources elsewhere, not in these last remaining conservation areas. And another pillar we need to continue consider is the local population. They find mechanisms for working with nature. There are lots of different initiatives which are community-driven and where these conservation areas are created by communities, as we've also heard. And I think that is the future, because people are willing to do this. They do it because they are motivated. And that will be sustainable, because everything which is simply imposed from above will need lots of money to protect it, but sooner or later these areas will be overrun. And I think what we need to do is to work from a variety of different angles. And as I say, putting all our eggs in one basket isn't a good idea, because destruction has just reached too far already. And in order to get back to the elephant, there are only 100,000, 150,000 forest elephants left, and about 300,000 of the savanna elephants. If the last areas where these animals can still live are also going to be diverted to different types of land use, infrastructure, road construction, or whatever, well, then we lose these animals, and we are responsible for what we leave to the succeeding generation. We have to make a choice. If we don't make that choice today, well, even if you make a choice today, I mean, an elephant, the generation of an elephant is 60 years. So even if we stop destroying the area today, it'll take decades until elephant populations can rebuild, far less be stable in certain areas. So we're already far too late in many ways. What we need also here in Germany is a Greta Thunberg who will go out on the street every Friday to make people aware, not just of climate change, but biodiversity. We need this because we are losing species unless we all recognize we need to do something now. You have addressed the point that it needed a Greta Thunberg and Fridays for Future to be taken sort of seriously, and I think it's quite exciting that even before Greta Thunberg, many young activists have been around. But they didn't come from the Global North, and they weren't heard the way they should have been. So one has to be honest enough to consider that particular honesty, or this dreadful scenario about this activist, the Ugandan activist, who was cut out of a photograph from an awards ceremony because, even though she was very much involved, and for certain reasons, she was not depicted in the photograph. And I think it's very important to bear in mind the larger picture and to consider many aspects, some of which we don't hear about, because there are many voices that are not being heard. The whole picture or the story is only true if the whole story is told. As Ms. Nkosi has said when the Humboldt Forum was open, that was very important. And it was important for me to mention that here. But with a view to the time, and I think I mentioned that already, it feels a bit like a race against time. You mentioned the generational period of an elephant, 60 years, and Ms. Kahumbu, you spoke of the fact that it's high time to change structures. Question now is, how much time have we actually got left in order to have an impact that will effect change? So what's the time by which we need to have achieved what in order to develop some sort of outlook for the future? What needs to happen when, so we can switch things around?
This is a very difficult question. Very difficult because what what wildlife needs, what nature needs around the world is not so much time, but space. We need space. It doesn't matter how much time you have. If you've got no space for elephants, they cannot survive. They just cannot survive. So we need to get space. And that the current estimation is that we need 30% of the earth, land and sea, to be protected. I think at the current level for many countries, the amount of land protected is well below 30% for most countries. In Kenya, it's around 22%. Tanzania is one of the few countries, has already gone beyond 40%, which is fantastic. What this means is if you have enough natural land secured and interconnected, it can sustain all of the natural processes that are needed. But if you have these small little pockets, things will blink out. They will blink out. So we need to secure more land for conservation on land and in the sea. And the sea, I think, is an even more serious, much more serious problem, because I think less than 15% of the oceans worldwide is protected, maybe less than even 5%. The ocean is the temperature engine for the planet. Without secured oceans and secured processes and ecological processes in the oceans, we will see climate change that will cause such a tremendous impact on the whole of the world that many of these protected areas will be rendered useless anyway. If you go to northern Kenya, the protected areas are just bare ground right now, and that's due to climate change combined with poor land use planning. I think everything is going to rest on climate change. If we fail to prevent climate change from running out of control, there's no amount of time is going to save wildlife and wild places. As things become drier, you've seen the fires that are happening right now in North America. They've secured quite a lot of land, but fires are now destroying so much land and so much nature. And this will become the norm. In some parts of the world, we're going to see much drier conditions, many more fires. Wild animals and plants in particular cannot move in order to move with the speed of climate change. Many parts of our continents will become wetter. And that means that the environment is also not conducive for certain other species. And when you look at areas which have very high biodiversity, the Congo Basin, the ocean, the coral reefs, if we look at some of the mountains in Africa, they have this extraordinary rich biodiversity, but with climate change, many species are just going to blink out even before we understand them. So I think that the question is not how much time do we have. The question is will we be able to prevent climate change from reaching a threshold that causes a planetary change that will be uncontrollable?
So, in your opinion, what are the steps specifically that need to be taken by humankind in order to counteract this development? Earlier, you mentioned how difficult it can be to motivate locals to make a commitment to nature conservation. So what were the levers that worked out well to motivate people and convince them of the fact that it is worth taking a risk? Because it's also about wondering who can afford to take a risk, also in economic terms, because they need to be able to make a living after all. So what are the steps that are necessary to that end?
Well, if we can secure 30% of the land area and the oceans, that will be amazing. But the people who live in those places will need to be able to make a decent living, right? They will need to make a decent living. They need to be able to go to school, get good jobs, and have a good, healthy lifestyle. I think it is possible. And I think that the more land area that is kept natural or is regenerated, it will allow us to combat the real serious problems of climate change. So that is what I think needs to be done. It's going to require some very difficult decisions by the global north. For example, right now we have funds coming into Africa for carbon credits. So companies in the West or in the North can pump out carbon dioxide so long as somebody in the global South is planting more trees. Well, it's even the process of getting funding for carbon to protect areas or to restore land, so complicated. A normal, ordinary person on the ground cannot do it. It's still international companies coming to Africa to help us to do it. This has to change. It has to be made easy. It cannot be kept in such a way that we are always it's always imbalanced. It's very severely imbalanced right now. I think another major area of concern is soil. We know now that most of the world's carbon is actually in the soil. But the way that we have been taught to farm is very destructive of the soil. And as a result, that carbon is being released back into the atmosphere. So in the global north now, you have regenerative agriculture, you have organic agriculture, but the chemicals made for accelerated farming production are still being shipped to the global south. We have chemicals being used in our farms in Kenya, which are banned in the countries where they are produced, whether it's in China, India, Europe, and even America. So we really need to have a very serious reckoning with the justice around some of these important issues. And I know it's difficult. I know there are major industrial corporations that are behind some of the decision-making that is taking place. There's agriculture is a major one, and agrochemicals, mining, and the destruction of nature to remove minerals that are used in the global north, but causing massive destruction and poverty and illness in Africa makes it very difficult for people to even care about climate change. If you go to northern Kenya and you ask people about climate change, they'll just think you're crazy. They've never heard of climate change. They know that they don't have enough water, their children are unhealthy, they don't have a job, they are depressed, they're resorting to drugs and alcohol to overcome their, just to make it from one day to the next. These are global climate issues, these are global issues, and many of them will become worse with climate change. Why is this important? I think in the news today, there was a huge article about trucks of immigrants arriving into the US where they were opened, and they found hundreds of people, economic migrants, trying to make their way into America. Now, these economic migrants, as we've seen in Europe in just the last few years, have the potential to even overrun the economies of Europe. If Africa implodes because of destruction of environment, habitat, water, all of the life support systems in order to serve northern economies, then there will be catastrophe. Climate change will make life impossible for people in Africa. And people will be forced to try and find a life somewhere else. There will be economic migrants pouring out of the continent in a way that we have never imagined before. We know it's been bad, but it will be impossible to contain it because people just will not be able to survive. So what I'm saying is the problem is not only about climate and it's not only about species. The problem is economic and the problem is political. And so it requires different kinds of people to get together and find new global solutions for this problem. It cannot be a problem of World Wildlife Fund. It cannot be a problem of wildlife and elephants. This is a problem that is far, far bigger than that.
Absolutely. So this brings us to the end of today's talk. And of course, I would love to hear the closing statements of our two guests in terms of what perspectives they're looking forward to, what the current projects are that are in the pipeline. So maybe you could start, Ms. Herbinger. Yes, I think we have talked about it repeatedly. We are at a moment where we need to bring about a change. We don't have any more time. Everything that we've been doing will keep having an effect for decades to come. And Paula said it. We need to get active at all levels. We need to engage in a transformation. We need a cycle economy. We need subsidies which don't have a negative impact on nature, but a positive impact on nature. There needs to be a dialogue between the global north and the global south. There needs to be a collaborative approach. We need to make information available in an easy way for the population to be able to make a contribution. I think there's so much to do. And my prospect for the future is that I have a lot to do. I still have a lot on my plate. I will keep making a contribution and a commitment to nature conservation and species protection. I think we are all well advised in doing something to that end. We can all make a contribution, be it by raising awareness, by providing funding, by making a political change, talking to decision makers, and so on. So that said, this is also something that I want to do for myself and demand for everybody else. Ms. Kahumbu, what's a prospect for you that you are looking forward to especially? What's in the offing that goes down the right path?
Well, first, I just want to say thank you so much for this great opportunity to talk about these issues. It's not every day we get to talk about everything from an elephant to the planet. I think that if you look at Greta and the impact Greta has had on the world, one person can transform attitudes around the whole world. And we have to remember this and use it more effectively. If we were to look at Africa when things are going really well, imagine if every African country has an educated population who understand environmental literacy. They understand better forms of agriculture, better forms of managing and understanding why these wild species and wild places matter, where the laws work and people abide by the laws. We can imagine a continent of such great wealth. I mean, Africa is a wealthy continent. Africa has the biodiversity billionaires, right? Imagine if we were able to achieve this through different ways, Greta and running a movement that is very powerful for young people. Television and filmmaking, storytelling, invoking our ancient cultures and tradition and our pride in our heritage. This is very powerful. When I started making my wildlife documentary series, everybody told me, forget about it. Africans don't care about animals. They're too busy. They're starving. They're sick. They don't care about animals. Well, 51% of people in Kenya have been watching my television show. They care about it. Just yesterday, somebody stopped me on the street to thank me and told me, you don't know who I am, but I want you to know my children are watching your films. We love you. We love what you're doing. Please don't stop. Tell us, how can we help? And this is the most important point. We need everybody to know that they have a role to play. How do we do this? How do we make it possible for everybody to be part of a solution of something so big, much bigger than themselves, a vision that they can be so proud of? I think that is really what we need, is a kind of new leadership and new thinking. I don't know, maybe we need some fantastic PR companies to help us to create something that will make us all feel excited to be part of something so important, even if we each of us only do something small. We've seen it before in other areas. We've seen it in politics, in elections. We've seen it in combating COVID. We've seen it in combating Ebola. I think we need to find a way to get that public buy-in, not just in Africa, Asia, South America, in all the world's important biodiversity areas. We need that buy-in so that we can actually stem the extinction crisis and also halt and combat climate change.
Ms. Kahumbu, I would like to thank you very much for taking the time to be a part of this discussion here in Berlin. Thank you so much, Ms. Habinger, for being here. This is the kickoff of a series of discussions, so I would like to invite you to watch Wildlife Warriors online. I'm sure it's available online. I have become quite curious, I have to say, and I would like to thank everybody who asked a question, also here in the audience. And you can meet me here again on November 22nd, when we will be talking about how people, spaces, and animals can interact in a better way. We will stay put for a little while here in this space of elephants, and if there are any more questions that you would like to ask Ms. Habinger here on site, you can do so. That said, I would like to say thank you and see you next time.
Thank you.